Hi, good evening, and welcome to Drugs, Crime, and Politics, sponsored by Drug Policy Forum of Texas here at Houston Media Source. We'd like to welcome today our guest, Annette Lamoureaux, and she's from the NAACP Houston. And I guess we'll start off with a little bit of news here tonight, unless, do we have Dean on the phone? Okay, so let's go to our friendly voice from the radio, Dean Becker, who's on KPFT radio stations, and see what he has to say. So, hello, Dean.
Good evening, Bendu. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak with your audience. Yes, I am on the radio here 6 days a week, every day but Sunday, on KPFT, which is 90.1 FM. All the shows I produce are about the harms of the drug war. We feature interviews with judges, congressmen, doctors, scientists, cops, you name it, people who have spent time in the trenches of the drug war and who are willing to discuss the subject. Today, sadly enough, the U.S. House did in fact vote down once again the Hinchy-Rohrabacher bill, which would have stopped federal funding of the Drug Enforcement Agency's efforts to thwart medical marijuana users in the 11 states that have already approved its use. And the good thing is we garner a little more each year. This year we got 2 more in favor of this bill.
And there were 2 more Republicans, too, in an election year, so that's kind of a good...
It's a good sign. Yeah. It is. And we'll provide coverage of some of the speeches given in advance of the vote today on the floor of the House on this week's Century of Lies program, which airs Friday at 1 p.m. on KPFT 90.1. Another bit of news that caught my attention this week, Maria Costas. He's the drug baron, or whatever you want to call him, for the United Nations. And he came out talking about the drug war as if they were having success, though the science and the stats prove quite differently. But he's saying that marijuana, again, it has become a more dangerous threat. And he's saying because it has THC, they used to say it led to insanity, criminality, and death. That's where they began, and now they're down to the point of saying it's dangerous because it has THC. I wanted to also point out that this Friday show, the Cultural Baggage Show, which airs at 7 p.m., will feature an interview with John Tierney. He's the New York Times columnist who has written several columns about the drug war, about the pain doctors and how they're being persecuted, etc. His most recent was about the Supreme Court ruling, how SWAT teams no longer have to knock before they kick in your door. And I was quite surprised to find that someone working on the New York Times staff had such an open mind, and I think it's an interview that you'll really enjoy. I'm also producing a video. The Drug Truth Network is now going to video production. I captured some video up in New Jersey a couple of weeks back, and the first one I put together is with Jack Cole. He's the Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And this is a group, again, of cops, wardens, prosecutors, both current and former officers who served time in the trenches of the drug war, and they are calling for an end of the drug war, seeing as a complete failure, a fiasco, and they tour the nation and, in fact, the world, exposing that truth. I'm also producing a new video, which, if things work out, we'll make available on Drugs, Crime, and Politics here in a few weeks, which will feature that interview with Jack Cole, as well as Dr. Robert Melamede, who talks about the endocannabinoid system and how it benefits our body, how our body, in fact, makes its own type of marijuana to keep us pain-free and healthy. And we'll also hear from Mr. Eric Sterling of the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, who worked with the U.S. House Judiciary Committee to write the draconian mandatory minimum drug laws, and this was all done following the death of basketball star Lynn Bias, and that anniversary was just a few days back. I want to invite folks to my website. There you can hear more than 100 programs featuring these same notables, and that website is drugtruth.net, and I urge folks to please tune in to KPFT every afternoon at 4:20 for the 420 Drug War News. And again, Bindu, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean. It sounds like you've been really busy.
I try to be.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Yeah, once again, we'd like to remind listeners that Dean is available for your listening pleasure on 90.1 KPFD here locally in Houston, as well as on over 50 stations across the country. So if you're traveling, you can always keep yourself updated on what's going on the war on drugs. And something, in light of today's vote, which is quite depressing, that only 2 more people signed on to the very important Hinchy-Rohrabacher Amendment, which would deny federal funding to DEA raids in states that have already legalized medical marijuana and already set up ID systems and have physician recommendations. Only 2 more people signed on and yes, this is in an election year, but not only is this a states' rights issue, but it's an alleviating human pain issue. So it was kind of something that we're going to have to all work on next year, and we'd like to thank everyone who wrote letters and called into your representatives in order to change this vote. On a brighter note, the one silver lining, I guess, is West Hollywood finally adopted a sane policy on pot where making possession a lowest level priority. And cities nationwide such as Seattle, Oakland, and Denver have already taken steps in this direction. The resolution just directs the law enforcement not to target marijuana users for criminal prosecution. Public policy would dictate that Houston or Harris County could kind of adopt the same type of measure in order to alleviate problems such as overcrowding in prisons and misuse of police enforcement. So, speaking of misuse of police enforcement, that's why we're so pleased to have our guest here. I'd like to give her an introduction because her resume was quite impressive. This is Annette Lamoureaux. How are you doing tonight?
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great, thanks. And Annette, you went to, graduated from Princeton U, went to Loyola Law School, went on to the ACLU of Connecticut and ACLU of Texas, and now you work at NAACP of Houston.
That's correct. I'm the Director of Legal Advocacy Programs at the NAACP Houston chapter, and I've been there since January. Okay,
and you were telling me earlier that NAACP is the oldest in the nation.
It's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it's the oldest civil rights organization in the country. It dates back to the beginning of the 20th century. And we continue to fight on behalf of the civil rights of all minorities, which is at least as much of an uphill battle today as it was in 1906.
There's certainly a lot of struggles that you guys have overcome. And before we get into that a little bit, I believe we have a caller. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take this call and see what you have to say. Hello?
Thank you very much. I want to focus on the gateway drug, which you've heard a lot of talk about it, especially today. But my question is if marijuana was removed from the picture, would it still be profitable to build or to dig these tunnels? And how would it change the funding of the drug trade through illegal trafficking? I think that it would be a lot easier for customs agents than to focus on the gateway.
Right. Thank you so much, caller, for raising this topic. It's a little off of what we were talking about, and I appreciate that you bring this up and raise this to our attention on most of the shows. I'm not as well educated, I guess, as Professor Terrell, who's not with us today, to answer this question. But something I can answer is that the gateway drug theory has been scientifically negated as I'm not sure in what study it was, but that there's no such real thing as this coined term gateway drug, which was termed by the Reagan era. And so if you take out, West Hollywood adopted, Denver, I think a city in Florida, and Oakland, Seattle have adopted policies where marijuana is taken out of the picture. And it is giving police officers a lot more priority to work on more violent crimes. And as I stated before, in Harris County especially, where we're having so many problems about overcrowding, if we were to stop arresting nonviolent criminal offenders, we'd have a lot more, we'd have police enforcement that are actually keeping us safe as opposed to, I don't know, people who are just hurting themselves, I guess.
Harris County sends more people to prison for low-level, nonviolent drug offenses than any other county in the state. And as it turns out, the vast majority of those folks, not a surprise, are Black and Hispanic.
Yeah, no doubt. The ACLU of Texas has a drug policy reform or law enforcement program. Yeah,
and certainly one of the big victories in the drug war of in recent days has been to eliminate the drug task forces, which we know were just essentially a cash cow for local law enforcement and put them in the business of actually selling drugs. And so I think that's a huge victory for people who are working on drug policy reform, is to get rid of all of that and use the money where it needs to be used in rehabilitation and actually addressing the problem of people who are addicted, not giving police larger SUVs.
Yeah. Well, drug task force is being eliminated. Is that I know that what happened in Texas pretty recently. Is that all across the country, or was that just specific to Texas?
Just in Texas, yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's yay, Texas. But go on. And one last thing I want to say about the gateway theory. If marijuana is a gateway drug, why don't we call something like caffeine or sugar, a gateway drug? That's one of the first drugs that kids start using, or marijuana is not the first drug that people really start using. But so thank you, caller, for bringing up that topic. And going back to Harris County, where you worked with the ACLU of Texas, did you have anything to do with prison reform?
Well, the ACLU does a lot of, it's really the only organization in the state that does any kind of prisoners' rights work. And one of the things that we know is historically, you have, because of the inequities in crack and powder cocaine sentencing, you have a disproportionate number of minorities in the prison system on just sort of a carousel, essentially, of in and out of the system, and especially with lower level drug offenses where people are getting sent to state jails. As it turns out, actually state jails, although they are the incarceration institution of choice for low-level drug offenses, they actually don't offer opportunities for rehabilitation. And in fact, it really almost assures that folks who are going into state jail are going to come out and reoffend, because you're just getting put in there for a short period of time with no effort being made to address the underlying drug problem. And so, although it looks better because people are getting put into prisons that are lower, well, that means a state jail essentially. If you're in it, it feels more like a prison than a jail. They're lower security, but in fact, at the end of the day, the recidivism rate is much higher than for people who go into prison.
Right. Was it the revolving door theory?
Exactly right.
And I think has there been any efforts made in Harris County to kind of reduce this problem?
Well, I think by the ACLU and other drug policy organizations, but the Harris County DAs continue to single out particularly minorities and send people away to prison. So that's why you have the largest number of low-level drug offenses are from Harris County.
And it's interesting. There is a person in Austin who has a radio show called Pedro Gatos, I believe, and he made a great point. We're going to try to have him on the show later at a later date, but that he's itemized, by year how minorities don't use drugs in any more prevalent number than any other person.
That's
and
correct.
Yet,
We certainly also know that from racial profiling statistics that blacks and Hispanics are far more likely to get stopped on a traffic stop, but as it turns out, Anglos are far more likely to actually have drugs when they get stopped in the traffic stop. So what that means is that you're just stopping far more, more people who are driving while black or driving while brown, and that they don't in fact have anything that results in an arrest.
Right.
And that's one of the valuable things about keeping the statistics, is that we know this is happening, but doing something about it is a whole other issue.
Right. Right, and so speaking of doing something about changing minority laws and everything, I guess, can we go back to...
It's all about me, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you're our guest here, so we were talking about the NAACP earlier and what you do with them, what work you do with them. So
I'm the Director of Legal Advocacy Programs. We have two programs that I primarily am in charge of. One of them is a Saturday legal clinic where we have folks who can just walk in from 10 to 2 every Saturday, except the Saturdays before a long weekend. So we don't have a clinic this Saturday because we're off for 4th of July. And it's the only program in the city of any legal services organization where we guarantee you that if you arrive before 2 o'clock, you will get to see a lawyer.
Oh, wow.
And we don't guarantee you that we can solve your problem that day, but you will get to see a lawyer who will be able to tell you if you have a claim or if there's something that can be done. And these are our service our clientele are folks who are at 125% of the poverty line, which is for a family of 4 is about $25,000. So if you're on any kind of Social Security, disability, public assistance, you're probably pretty much going to qualify. And then we also have a program where we serve folks who are HIV positive, and that is the Ryan White Grant, which is through the county by the feds, Title I, and that's about 300% of the poverty line. And again, anyone who, as long as it's a non-criminal matter, we can help folks with evictions, Social Security appeals, any variety of civil problems. And in fact, today I was in Brenham working with a woman who's a victim of domestic violence. So we're also, since I've been there, we've expanded some of our services. So now we're able to do things like protective orders for domestic violence abuse victims and things like that.
Wow, yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't think that's usually normal to travel out.
This particular person just happened to be between two legal service corporation territories.
Okay.
So she was just sort of caught in the middle, and so she's going back to San Antonio, but she just needed someone to come to a hearing with her tomorrow. But we were just really pleased that we were in a position to be able to do that, because we're not a legal services corporation organization. We have a little bit more flexibility about things, so we were actually able to just get up there and help her. So that was really gratifying.
Right on. And I'd like to invite callers, if you guys would like to call in, our number is 713-807-1794, if you'd like to call in for any questions or comments. And I really appreciate what you're doing with NAACP. I know also another project you were working on was post 9/11. What a lot of people didn't hear about is the egregious errors that FBI was making on the Muslim community. And what they were doing there was just basically, completely barring any civil rights or civil liberties that anybody had, and just, wiretapping. And you kind of represented a lot of people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, beginning after September 11th, the FBI set out to interview folks who fit a particular profile. They said the profile that they said they were using to interview were men from Arab, Muslim, and South Asian countries, predominantly Muslim countries, in a certain age group that were here on non-immigrant visas, because they said that those matched the profiles of the hijackers. As it turned out, over the next several years, they actually just pretty much targeted mostly men from South Asian countries, predominantly Muslim countries and South Asian countries. And so, yes, I've done a number of those interviews. These were, in theory, all voluntary interviews. But certainly when an FBI agent shows up at your door, no matter how voluntary he or she may say it is, it doesn't feel very voluntary if you're from a country where you have no civil rights. So the ACLU of Texas was one of the few affiliates in the country that offered free legal assistance to folks who were being interviewed by the FBI. And so I sat in on a number of those interviews.
Oh, wow.
And the last several weeks have proved very gratifying, because what we now know is what we had suspected all along, was that some of the basis that they were using for the interviews were things like illegal wiretaps, monitoring large wire transfers going out of the country. And I've had clients who, the FBI doesn't tell you why they're interviewing them, but you sort of try and figure it out. And I've had a number of clients that we now know, we were right about why they were being interviewed and what the source of the information was.
Right. So just basically false information. And
well, not false information, but illegally obtained information. So, I've had clients who, in fact, called suspect countries, or countries that the FBI considers to be suspect, and they're perfectly legitimate phone calls, but the FBI obtained the information through the NSA without using any kind of it was a warrantless search, essentially. So,
yeah, that's amazing how it was done. And that another thing that you have expertise on is the USA Patriot Act.
I think it's not really accurate just to refer to the wholesale violation of people's civil rights and civil liberties since September 11th just as the Patriot Act, because many of the most egregious violations have occurred without any authorization under the Patriot Act or any other legislation. A lot of them have been through executive orders. And what we have seen is, and this also applies to the drug war as well, is just an erosion of people's civil rights over the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years as a result of the drug war. And then in addition to that, since September 11th, it's reached a whole other level, so that now the government apparently thinks nothing of sending out, of monitoring private phone calls, private transactions, and it's just a constant chipping away that I think most people don't realize how much has happened since September 11th, that we are certainly no more safe and we are considerably less free.
Right. As they say, if you ignore your rights, they go away. But especially in the war on drugs, the FBI, if someone comes knocking on your door, you're not going to say, oh, well, most people would think that they're not going to say, oh, well, no, thank you, you can't come in. But that's exactly what you should say, not without my lawyer.
So you should never, ever, ever speak to any law enforcement person without a lawyer present.
Yes.
As I'm fond of telling my clients, I would not talk to the FBI without having a lawyer. It's very important. And one of the things that we learned through doing these interviews after September 11th was how many questions they asked that were completely unconstitutional. I mean, things like, do you attend a mosque? What are your political beliefs? And because we had lawyers present during that questioning, my clients didn't answer those questions.
Right.
But what we also know is that vastly more people talked with the FBI without lawyers than with lawyers.
Right.
And the same thing applies to anybody being arrested or for drug or any other crime. You don't ever talk to the cops without anybody with a badge. You don't talk to anybody with a badge without a lawyer.
Right.
They're nice guys. They're doing their job, but they're not your friends.
Exactly. As they say in the Busted video, they're not your friends. They're not your priest. They're not your counselor or something or
That's
other.
right.
Well, let's go ahead and take this caller and.
Whoops.
Okay, I guess not.
That wasn't.
Was it line 1 or line 2? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Sorry. Well, I guess I'll invite that caller to call back in. Hopefully we can get them back on the air. But yeah, something in the war on drugs, obviously people give up their rights all the time. That's why we have so many low-level offenders, I guess. Being pulled over on the street, driving in your car, walking on down the street, or at your house. So a great video to enlighten yourself on how to avoid such, obvious slips of your civil rights is called Busted. It's a Citizen's Guide to Police Encounters. There's an organization that puts it out called Flex Your Rights, and I think last week or the last show we got to show a few clips from it. So Ira Glasser actually narrates it. So and he does a great job. So it's a really, really great video.
And you can also download Know Your Rights brochures from the ACLU website, which is at www.aclu.org. And therein, I think last time I checked, it was up to like 10 different languages.
Oh, wow.
English, Spanish, Urdu, Arabic, Cambodian, Tagalog, whatever, Chinese, Vietnamese.
Wow.
Anything that not anything, but the thing that the vast majority of people speak, you can download that Know Your Rights brochure, which is very useful.
Definitely something to carry around with you.
Right.
So, I mean, what other programs when you were working with the ACLU of Texas? I'm quite curious. What else did you work on?
I took over my job started in the January of 2002. So we did a lot of work immediately involving the September 11th assault on people's civil liberties. And then I also, when I was in Connecticut, was one of the lawyers on what has turned out to be a very well-known case at this point involving a national security letter. There have only been 2 cases where folks who received national security letters chose to challenge them. And one of them involved a client in Connecticut, which was an organization that keeps library records. And the reason that this was important was because all through the debate on the Patriot Act, John Ashcroft said that Section 215, which allows the government to look into library records, that this was just a bunch of paranoid librarians and we'd never do that. And in fact, it turns out they indeed were doing it, and that this particular organization kept library records for a consortium of libraries in Connecticut. So it was really a needle in the haystack kind of search that the FBI was looking for. But one of the things that's very disturbing is that the FBI has, I believe it's about 30,000 NSL letters. I think that number may be too high, several thousand NSL letters that they have sent out, and it says on the face of the letter, you are not allowed to tell anybody that you've received this letter.
Oh, wow.
And so we were under a gag order, as were our clients, not to talk about the facts of the case. And so we actually had hearings or meetings in chambers with the judge that were under seal and that we weren't allowed to talk about. And we had to file things. And I never thought in my life I would show up and say, looking for somebody in the U.S. Attorney's Office saying I need to have somebody with a high enough security clearance to serve them with papers.
Oh, my goodness.
It was surreal.
Yeah.
But there was a wonderful moment, all culminated in a wonderful moment in a courtroom in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where the future of the First Amendment was on the line, and where Ann Beeson, who's the assistant director of the legal department of the ACLU, was arguing to preserve the First Amendment, and the government was essentially arguing that as long as they said national security, the First Amendment didn't matter.
Oh my God.
And fortunately, the judge saw it our way, not their way, and the First Amendment is still mostly intact. In fact, recently the government, and this again proves that what we were saying was right all along, was that we believe that one of the reasons they didn't want our clients to talk was because the debate on the Patriot Act was going on, and that by being gagged about the NSL, they could not testify and tell Congress that in fact, they were serving these things on libraries. And as soon as the Patriot Act debate was over, the government said that, well, they'd be willing to lift the gag order. And in fact, several weeks ago, they decided that they didn't want the records anymore either.
Wow, that's amazing.
So if you're out there and you get an NSL letter, you need to call a lawyer. And then we now have, although they tried to put this provision in that you couldn't even talk to your lawyer about getting an NSL letter, I believe it still stands that the gag order does not apply to a conversation with a lawyer. So you need to call the ACLU or some other organization, preferably the ACLU, if you get an NSL. And we know that there's many thousands of people out there who've gotten these things and didn't call anybody.
Wow, yeah. What exactly does an NSL letter say?
It's a national security letter. It's asking for, it's essentially it's a kind of subpoena in a way, except that the problem with it is it's not signed off on by any judge. It's just issued by the FBI. And it says that because it's a matter of national security, they want some kind of records, and that you're not allowed to tell anybody about it because it's a matter of national security. And so what the government has taken to doing routinely is they say national security, national security, national security, and that's a way to prevent anyone into looking into what they're actually doing and having their activities being subjected to judicial oversight, which is what the Constitution, we thought, said that you had to do if you were a law enforcement person, but they've been doing this consistently. But we feel this particular case, this Connecticut case, has really vindicated a lot of what we were saying all along, which was that they have been running amok.
Completely. Well, congratulations on that. I'm sure that was kind of
I did the litigation bag carrying, but congratulations to Ann Beeson and the other folks at the ACLU legal department. It was a really important case, and I was really delighted to have been a small part of it.
Yeah. I mean, and that would be affecting everyone nationally, not just in Connecticut.
Yes, absolutely, all around the country. Yes, there are only 2 cases that have challenged these NSL letters, and this was one of them.
Wow, and I'm sure there have been literally thousands.
Yes.
Okay. Well, and that was particularly mostly just to involve, people with 9/11, or just anything?
Well, again, this is what we now know about the way the government has taken to operating. Is in theory, a lot of this stuff is under the guise of a terrorist is a terrorist investigation, and that when they passed the Patriot Act, what they said was that we trust us. We're the government. Trust us. We're only going to use this in appropriate circumstances. We're never going to investigate anybody who isn't a terrorist or isn't connected to a terrorist investigation. Well, but in fact, what we know is that that's not the case. They've used it in connection with investigating, I think it was strip clubs in Las Vegas.
Wow.
But because all of this is, again, under the guise of national security, it's almost impossible, and because there's a judicial oversight, it's almost impossible to prove that they're lying. And so that was why this library case was so important, was because they said, well, we'd never do this. Trust us. We're the government. We're not going to look at anybody's library records. Well,
right.
We know that they were. So in this particular case, although we don't know the circumstances leading to this investigation, I know that the judge was not impressed. She did have a high enough security clearance to look at the actual warrant.
What was actually
going on. And she was like, yeah, I'm not convinced. And so we don't, but all the other 30,000 or whatever they are, the other thousands of letters out there, we don't know what they were. Other letters.
Or what kind of civil liberties they gave up without knowing it.
We don't know, FISA, other kinds of FISA courts. All the government has to do is to say it's related to an investigation. And that's enough to get a subpoena. And again, we don't know. The government just says, trust us. So, the same government who's still looking for Saddam Hussein and still looking for weapons of mass destruction, but just trust them. Yeah.
Still looking for Osama, I guess. So the moral of the story is, if you don't know, call the ACLU. Don't call the cops. I'm just kidding. But we'll come back to you, to our audience, in about 2 or 3 minutes after this short break, and we look forward to your calls and comments and speaking a little bit more with Ms. Lamoureaux. So join us again.
It's time to play Name That Drug by its side effects. Dehumanization, solitude, degradation, deprivation, dehydration, starvation, injury, humiliation, torture, suffocation, untimely teenage deaths. Time's up. The answer is not a drug. It is drug treatment. Tough love.
This week in drug war history, April 3rd, 1953. With the support of Alan W. Dulles, Director of Central Intelligence, Richard C. Helms proposes funding for a biochemical warfare program named MK-Ultra. One of the chemicals administered to the unwilling participants was LSD. April 5th, 2000. The Journal of American Medical Association publishes Trends in Medical Use and Abuse of Opioid Analgesics. April 6, 1995. ABC News airs a special entitled America's War on Drugs, Searching for Solutions, in which legalization is presented as an alternative to the failing war on drugs. April 6, 1998. Dr. Dennis Rosenbaum's 6-year study of 1,798 students assessing the effects of a school-based drug education, a 6-year multi-level analysis of Project DARE, finds that DARE may actually be counterproductive. April 6, 2000. The first professional education of the healthcare community in therapeutic cannabis since 1938 is held at the University of Iowa. This is Steve Nolan for the Drug Truth Network.
Welcome back to Drugs, Crime, and Politics. We're coming to you live from Houston Media Source, sponsored by Drug Policy Forum of Texas, and we'd like to thank you for watching. Please call in if you have any questions or comments. That really is what makes us go, and we have people who are watching like to ask us some questions so we can show off the expertise that we have here. And I think the number is 713-807-1794, and I promise I won't hang up on you if you call in. So, once again, we're here with Annette Lamoureaux, and you're with NAACP of Houston.
That's correct.
And we were previously talking about the ACLU, and I'm sorry, there's just kind of something that I kind of agree with, and there's something in the news in the last few weeks. I don't know if you'd heard about it, but the scandal behind bars in Tallahassee, Florida.
I'm sorry?
It's basically these, I think it was a federal investigation.
Oh.
Yeah.
Where the federal agents were shot.
Federal agents were shot. Guards accused of trading money and drugs for sex with female prisoners. Prison lobby shootout in which a guard and federal agent were killed. And first of all, this is just a blatant representation of how, if you can't keep drugs out of federal prisons, then how are you going to keep it off the streets? I mean, really. And just also another blatant representation of corruption in law enforcement. It's just amazing rates. But I'm wondering, a similar case happened in the DFW area, my home territory, in Haltom City, and I don't know if you heard about this, but blatant abuse of women prisoners, and that came out in their independent media as well. So that was something that was pretty huge. I think it was a county prison or
county jail.
Yeah, county jail. So I'm wondering what type of civil liberties do prisoners have, if any at all?
Well, this Eighth Amendment, again, which is the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, is the constitutional rubric for looking at what kind of civil rights and civil liberties violations go on in prison. Whoever's keeping you, and this applies whether or not it's TDC or whether it's the county, has an obligation to take care of you while you're in their custody. So that means they have to feed you, they have to provide you with medical care. If you haven't been convicted of a crime, the standard is somewhat higher or lower, depending on how you want to look at it, that they have to take better care of you, as it were, before you're actually convicted.
Really?
And when I was in one of the interesting things about Connecticut, which although it's the same geographic size as Harris County, is that they actually have their own prison system. They don't have jails. And we actually had a consent decree against the only women's prison in Connecticut. That was about 20 years old. That had, it was very striking to me to see the similarities between that and what had happened in this federal prison in Tallahassee, where it is very common in women's prisons for there to be, a trade in sex, essentially. Historically, statistically, and I'm not a sociologist, but I know that there's been a lot of work done on this. Women who are sent to prison are generally less violent than men. Women tend to be sent to prison for property crimes or drug offenses. And so you have a lot of women who are in prison who are not violent, but they're in prison for some period of time, and the only thing they have to trade for privileges is sex. And so you have a generally male population, or sometimes a female population, and so you have, it's really a recipe for disaster.
Right.
And, is that a violation of your civil rights? Absolutely. The Constitution, in case, if you're a prison guard out there and you don't know this, the Constitution prohibits prison guards, intimidating prisoners of any gender into having sex or trading contraband for sex. And certainly the relationship between a prison guard and an inmate is one in which one could argue that consent is not possible, because the consequences of refusing sexual advances potentially is I suppose at worst life-threatening, but certainly threatens your liberties. The Texas prison system has one of the worst histories of prison rape of any prison system in the country.
Wow.
And the ACLU had just recently lost, in fact, a case involving the rape of a prisoner in a prison up in the Panhandle. And it was clear that, in fact, the prison authorities had known about it and had really done nothing. The particular prisoner was gay, and so their feeling was, well, you like it, or don't you? So not our problem. And there's a huge problem with prison rape in Texas. In the male prisons, not just in the women's prisons. And so it's rampant, just absolutely rampant. And again, you have, it's all part of the same vicious cycle. Is you put more people in, because it's not just due to the drug war, because certainly Texas tends to be a more law and order state than many other places, but the drug war exacerbates it because you have so many people being put into prison in this revolving door, or low level offenses. And so then that results in overcrowding, and then you have to build more prisons, and then the pool of people who actually want to be prison guards, is smaller and smaller.
Right,
and
the guard to inmate ratio.
Right, and the pay is low. When you build prisons in places like Palestine, Texas, your choice is you work at Walmart or you work in the prison. So you're not looking at folks who are necessarily, these aren't the people who have masters in criminal justice. There certainly are people in the prison system at higher levels who do, and I don't mean to malign everyone who works for TDC, but certainly, you put all this stuff in the cauldron, and you can't help but have problems. And because of the Ruiz suit that was filed, expiring, a federal judge was overseeing the Texas prison system for 20 years. Well, when that suit met its end, we now know that we know that TDC was just waiting for that to expire to start back with some of the violations, and having what we would consider to be violations, which are no longer violations of the law, but are certainly not the way that we would like to see prisoners treated or inmates treated. And so the Texas prison system is really a simmering cauldron.
Right. Leaves much to be desired.
And you also have an aging prison population, which is the other ticking time bomb, is that you have a lot of folks in prison who are on long sentences because if you're a repeat offender, you're getting 10, 20 years. So you have a geriatric prison population that is presenting with increasingly serious age-related health problems. So that's becoming very expensive to treat them. And so the health care is just getting worse and worse and worse.
Right. The Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is generally a very moderate, conservative, Republican organization, had a great editorial in the Houston Chronicle in the Sunday edition 2 or 3 weeks ago. And they itemized how much just in Harris County alone, the most overcrowded and the most expresses the most abuse. Another place where you can read about this is Grits for Breakfast. I'll mention that again.
Which is Scott Henson's blog.
Yeah, great blog. I start my morning off with that. But the Texas Public Policy Foundation, he itemized how much Houston would have to spend monthly in order to, we have 1,100 prisoners sleeping on the floors. How much, a prison, a guard to inmate ratio, we're only supposed to have like 20 or 30. They have like 40 or 50 ratio. And how much, it was literally millions of dollars a month just in order to alleviate this problem. So before I get into this too much, I'd like to take our caller here. Hello and welcome to Drugs, Crime, and Politics.
It's Dean Becker calling back.
Great.
I have a question for Annette. I'm enjoying the program, but I haven't heard y'all talk much about this. The situation, the Supreme Court ruling that the cops, whether they're good-hearted or stupid, if they don't knock, it's okay.
The no-knock rule.
Yes, and I was wondering her thoughts,
Well,
is that not unconstitutional? I mean, the
Supreme Court has now said it's not unconstitutional.
Right.
Now, I think that sort of the more frightening take, my take on that is what this says about the new Supreme Court. I don't think that given the composition of this Supreme Court, I didn't find the ruling a particular surprise. I mean, they certainly have been going down that road for a while. But I think that what this says is that you now have a Supreme Court where Justice Kennedy is the swing vote, and he is certainly more liberal than Justice Scalia and has become more liberal over the years, but there are certainly going to be things where he is not going to come down on what I would consider to be the right side of the issue, and that Sandra Day O'Connor really was the finger in the dike. And it's a terrible thing to sound like Chicken Little and then have the sky actually fall on you. This is what we all were saying in the last election, was that these two Supreme Court nominees, at least one, if not two, of the Supreme Court nominees were going to be absolutely crucial in the fight in maintaining, the attacks or fighting off the attacks on civil liberties. And I think that decision is the beginning. This is the beginning of where this court is going to go. It does not bode well. And I think that it's very, Supreme Court justices are not a sexy topic when you're at the ballot box. But the thing is, what people don't realize is the decisions that the Supreme Court makes actually do have an effect on people's lives, and particularly in the area of civil rights, and the chipping away over the last 15 years as a result of the drug war, the last 20 years has been bad. I predict you haven't seen anything yet. This is a court that is going to be determined to pretty much undo as many of these kinds of, what we take for granted, the Warren Court decisions dating back to the 60s. Scalia clearly disagrees with a lot of them, and now you have this combination of folks. If we look back in several years, and he finds this particular decision disturbing, it's going to be a blip on the radar screen.
Oh, that's not encouraging. Yeah, it was a 5-4 decision, I guess. This is in the light of, I think, in Sunset, Florida, a SWAT team broke down somebody's door and actually killed a man, finding, just a couple of grams, 2 ounces of pot, actually, So thank you, Dean, for calling in and talking about that.
Although I will have to say, if the SWAT team is banging at your door, that extra 2 seconds to flush stuff down the toilet isn't really going to help you that much.
Right.
You're in trouble. You're in a lot of trouble already if they have a battering ram banging down your door.
And that's the problem, with this person that was killed recently. A 23-year-old bartender killed last August, found 2 ounces of pot in his apartment or house, whatever. Looks like we have another caller, so let's go ahead and take that phone call. Hello, caller.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, at first no, but if I get pulled over by a police officer, what are my rights? Do I have to get out of the car?
If you're pulled over by a police officer on a traffic stop, the best thing that you can do just off the bat is to keep your hands on the steering wheel. Mm-hmm. Don't make any threatening moves. I mean, one of the things that any officer who does traffic stops will tell you is that the vast majority of cops who are killed during traffic stops. So they're getting out, they're looking for, every time they get out of the car, they are concerned about whether or not you're going to have a gun under your seat that you're going to take out and blow their brains out. So one of the mistakes I think people make that get themselves into trouble is you start arguing with the cop, and then that escalates, and then that's when people end up, down on the ground with their hands behind their head. If it's a routine traffic stop, you do not have to get out of the car. You have to produce your license. You have to produce proof of insurance. You have to produce registration, although in Texas it's usually visible on the on your dashboard anyway. That's the only thing that you're required to prove for a traffic stop. If you are pulled over on a traffic stop, the officer has every right to look in your window and on the front seat and the back seat to determine if you have anything illegal in plain view.
The plain view rule.
Yeah, so if you have a kilo of Coke on your back seat, the cop has every right to have you get out of your car.
Right.
On the other hand, if you have your kilo of Coke in the trunk,
locked away safely,
as it should be, then the officer cannot just routinely tell you to open the trunk. This is just in the context of a routine traffic stop. If you ran a red light or your inspection sticker is expired or whatever. If you are driving erratically, and the officer believes that you are driving while you're under the influence of a controlled substance or under alcohol, then the officer absolutely can make you get out of the car and subject you to a field sobriety test. If you are arrested and your car is impounded, then they can search you. It's a search incident to arrest. They can search your car if your car is impounded. What I see a lot, in fact this happened a couple of weeks ago right outside my office, are people who are pulled over on traffic stops, who generally, at least as I've seen it happen, tend to be black or brown, and who are searched even though they're not arrested. And you do not have to give a consent to a search if you are just simply pulled over for a traffic stop. Exactly. You do not have to give a consent to search your car if you are just pulled over for a traffic stop. So unless there is something in the back of your back seat or your front seat that's incriminating, that leads the officer to believe that there are other things somewhere else, or else if you act in some way that lets the officer to believe that they are in personal danger, they absolutely cannot search your car without your consent. Right. Still, as of today. But the term isn't over yet.
Right. As you said, we may have more and more non-encouraging things. Let me go ahead and the website where you can find that video I was talking about earlier, Busted, A Citizen's Guide to Police Encounters, is flexyourrights.org. And it'll have in video form, I guess, what Annette was saying, and in not such a summarized form. And some of the best statements you can learn in your life are, I do not consent to a search, and am I free to go now? So, yeah. And one of the pieces of advice that I try and give people oftentimes is you never want to get into an argument with a police officer. That argument, you are never going to win that argument. And so the best way to deal with any law enforcement is to be polite but firm.
Thank you, officer. No, I don't consent to give that search. Unfortunately, sometimes you need to just act like a well-informed attorney so that not to act in a way that then provides further reason for the officer to think that you're being hostile and they want to arrest you. But I think generally, most officers are aware of the law. And if you are polite but firm, then they're going to have no choice but to follow the law. If you become belligerent, then which is a bad idea. And that's what happens to a lot of people, I think, is that they, in the course of exercising their rights, which is perfectly reasonable, they become belligerent and they just make the cop mad. And at that point, the cop is going to do what the cop needs to either, restore order or just because you pissed him off. And that is never going to end well. So when you're exercising your rights, you just need to be very calm and just say, thank you, officer. I'll be on my way. No, I don't give you I don't give your consent to search that cooler in the trunk of my car that has a lot of contraband drugs in it. Right. And don't say that either. That was a joke. Don't ever volunteer that information.
Yeah.
And that's another thing. You don't ever volunteer information. You only answer direct questions, but you don't all volunteer information.
Right. When in doubt, I guess, keep your mouth shut.
And when in doubt, keep your mouth shut, yes.
So let's, I guess, take another call. And hi, caller. Welcome to Drugs, Crime, and Politics.
Yes, good evening, ladies. How are you?
Good evening. How are you?
Pretty good. I wanted to make a comment as far as, in the city of Houston, me being an African-American male, there is a lot of racial profiling in the city, and the situations that you two are explaining are not necessarily, you cannot compare them to citizens that have, I don't want to say criminal records, but are more racially profiled in the city of Houston. If you have four African-American males riding in a Cadillac, you are more subjective to be pulled over.
Absolutely.
In part of town, whereas if you have four elderly white senior citizens riding somewhere, you will not be pulled over.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right.
So the point I'm trying to make is that you cannot necessarily have the viewers agree with the opinions that you are trying to express on the air, where in the situations that you've presented, you are correct that a lot of citizens, will just get a simple traffic ticket and, get searched and let go. But in the event that African American is pulled over riding with one or more male occupants in the vehicle, you're more subjected to be pulled out, where more police units are called to the scene. It doesn't matter if you have a traffic ticket or if you have drugs in the vehicle. I mean, that's how it is.
No,
So the point that I want to ask you is that how do you feel that African American drivers are portrayed in the city of Houston, whereas a white or anybody else or anybody that's non-minority is portrayed as a violator that is breaking the laws in Houston? If we're all supposed to be considered one, which Houston is a city that is very diverse and a multicultural community, there are African Americans and Hispanics are still...
Right. So, caller, let me go ahead and tell you before, let me say something. We joke around about it here and everything because we obviously know that, not saying that, I have this and that contraband in the car, we kind of know how to respond to cops. But all of these, I don't consent to a search, being as polite as possible, these are suggestions. And in the true event of being pulled over by a cop, there's no guarantee that you're not going to be face down on the ground. But this is the best way to handle police situations is by not consenting to a search, which is your Fourth Amendment right, and by being as polite but not answering any questions. Cops will play gotcha games with you, play mind games. Sorry, caller, I guess they hung up. But thank you for calling in. Try to play gotcha games and try to basically entrap you. So these are the disclaimer is out there. The disclaimer is on the video busted from Flex Your Rights. These are just suggestions. In the true event that you are arrested, you will need to consult a lawyer, if not the ACLU. And I'll let Annette handle, I'm not sure what the caller exactly.
Well, I think in fact it's even more important if 4 African males driving a Cadillac are pulled over on a traffic stop. It's even more important for those individuals to make it clear to the officers that they are calm and polite and to not get belligerent, because you're exactly right. That's the kind of a situation, unlike for elderly white people, just to be realistic about it, where the cops are going to be more likely to have you down on the ground, and so to be super polite, because the cops are going to be looking for it to escalate. Mm-hmm. And what we do know, around the state of Texas from the racial profiling statistics, the city of Houston would argue what their statistics mean, although we do know again that more African Americans and more Latinos are pulled over on traffic stops than white people, but more white people are arrested. So what that means is that more African Americans and Latinos are being pulled over on pretextual stops. So again, you're absolutely right. It is, you certainly are a target, and if you believe that you've been a victim of being racially profiled, you are absolutely within your rights to fill out a complaint with HPD, and they have to keep track of all of those statistics. They have to report them to the city council, and if there's one officer, like I know I've heard stories about sometimes in a particular neighborhood, there's one officer or one constable who people perceive as being, particularly singling out minorities. You file a complaint on that person. Go to that law enforcement agency, fill out a complaint to be investigated by Internal Affairs that you're being racially profiled. I realize that if you're down on the ground with a gun at your head, that's not very helpful advice. But by the same token, the law that requires reporting of statistics on racial profiling potentially is a very powerful tool, but people have to use it. And under the law, if there's a racial profiling complaint filed against an officer, it has to be investigated. So even though it may feel like you're trying to move a beach with a teaspoon, if no one files the racial profiling complaints, then no officer is ever going to be investigated or disciplined. Whereas if you have one officer, and I believe that every law enforcement agency is going to have a few bad apples in it. Mm-hmm. Some law enforcement agencies are going to have a lot of bad apples in it. But I think that generally, if it looks like there are 1 or 2 officers who are repeat offenders, at some point the law enforcement agency is going to have to take some sort of steps, because if that continues to get reported that there's 1 or 2 officers who are repeatedly engaging in that behavior, then that starts to become a problem for that agency. But if people aren't reporting the racial profiling incidents, then no one's being given any tools to go after those officers. And on the other hand, the other side of that is then the agency, if the agency is not investigating officers who are being reported for racial profiling, that's a problem for the agency. But if no one's reporting the racial profiling, then there's no way to prove that. So, right. We all say, yeah, we know that people who are black and brown get stopped more often than white people. But if no one's filing racial profiling complaints, there's not anything for anybody to be able to do about that.
That's amazing. I didn't know that there was actually a racial profiling, law that you could call against cops. And so she's absolutely right. If you're not calling them out on it, then who is? And now, I guess we're going to go ahead and take another call. But I hate to cut you off, caller, but we're kind of running out of time here. So I invite you to state your question, and welcome to Drugs, Crime, and Politics.
Thank you very much. In talking about the so-called Al-Qaeda cell in Miami, where it turns out that the government provided the camera, the government provided the booths, and the only Al-Qaeda person was the actual government agent involved. What are the guidelines or laws regarding agents provocateurs in either terrorist and or drug cases?
Well, thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I don't know how much time
we've got 2 minutes
we have left. I think that the quote-unquote Al-Qaeda cell in Miami is going to turn out to be a bunch of wannabe Al-Qaeda people. I don't think there really is an Al-Qaeda cell operating in South Miami or wherever it was. Agent provocateurs, unfortunately, again, the Supreme Court is not particularly sympathetic on that level. I think what this is indicative of is the pressure that the government is under 5 years after September 11th, to have something to show for their terrorism investigations. And if this is the best they can do, then I got to tell you, I'm sleeping pretty soundly at night. If there are al-Qaeda cells operating in the United States, which I've never been convinced of. I think that this kind of investigation where they're going out trying to set people up, as we know in the drug wars, doesn't work very well. And so, I mean, if those folks end up going off to prison, I think that that's going to be a tragedy, because to me, that's not what we should be afraid of.
Right. We shouldn't be in fear of our own government, I guess.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Right. So, well, we'd like to wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Annette, for being on
Thank you for having
me. If you ever have any questions, ACLU or NAACPHouston.org. Thank you, Drugs, Crime, and Politics and Drug Policy Forum of Texas, and join us 2 weeks from now. So, are we on?
Present policy of drug prohibition is hopeless. It is hopeless. It will never get better. Literally, victory today is being defined as slowing down the pace of defeat.
We ought to listen to science and medicine when it comes to whether marijuana or any other substance has a medical benefit.
The fact that marijuana is a less dangerous drug.
We're going full-blown into a program that has failed and failed every other time we've tried it. Please point out one success in 30 years of an eradication program that has stopped drugs from coming to this country. Point out one success, because I reviewed that research and there isn't.